The Murderer's Confession by Jorge Majfud. Upon his arrival at Carrasco International Airport, Santiago Arbiza was pleasantly surprised by the new construction. The little country's recent economic success was reflected in the ultra-modern features of the small airport, which lacked nothing compared to progressive giants like the United States or Japan. Yet, as he hailed a taxi and quickly came upon the chaos of Montevideo, he amended that perhaps the country itself had not changed so much. The meandering streets appeared haphazard to his eyes, accustomed as they were now to the wide boulevards of Georgia and Florida. The sound of car horns filled the air as drivers routinely yelled insults and expletives out their windows while they made their way through traffic. Upon receiving his degree and surgeon's license, Santiago had been lucky to be accepted into the British hospital back here, but nobody was surprised. He had been expected to return to his home country, and this offered the best pay in Montevideo. It also included a set of conditions that would allow him to carry out certain projects he had in mind long before he had pursued the M.D. at Emory University in Atlanta. His parents were proud. Santiago had been rescued from a dysfunctional family marked by a rural culture of domestic violence and abuse, leading to young Santiago's aggressive and entirely inappropriate behavior. From the age of 3, he had shown a behavior that extended well beyond the classic tantrums children have at that age. The behavior had gotten him referred to a psychologist for 4 consecutive years, until he was 7 and calmed down some. When he entered kindergarten, he still had frequent fits of rage. Then he started touching his classmates inappropriately, leading to a scandal and his expulsion for misconduct. His adoptive parents enrolled him in a Catholic boarding school, where psychologists voiced suspicions about the abuse that had led to his birth parents' loss of custody. On the first Monday after his arrival in Montevideo, Dr. Santiago Arbiza saw his first patient, a 69-year-old male. The man, who upon hearing his full name announced by the receptionist, boomed, "My friends call me BB. Everyone else calls me Colonel Ruiz Diaz, or just Colonel," showed no serious visible symptoms. Examination of this gentleman with the big, bright smile revealed a slightly stooped yet physically fit older male in prime health, except for one critical detail: coronary obstruction. While the doctor refined his diagnosis, the retired military officer admired the cleanliness and spaciousness of the office. In his day, he asserted, the British military hospital was dark and musty. It definitely did not smell of fruit candles, and the doctors were not so elegantly dressed. "I exercise every morning," the colonel went on to detail his daily habits, as Dr. Arbiza barely lifted his eyes from the patient's report. "I eat healthy food and only drink Black Label whiskey, although I don't eat out as much as I used to. Every afternoon I walk along the Rambla de Pocahontas from 5 o'clock to 6:30. I also have a very active sex life, and don't even need Viagra," he went on to boast. Then he digressed into disjointed mumbling about his sadness at the decline of society since the Marxists had taken over the government. It had been legal, no question about it, because elections should always be respected, but still, they had lied their way into office. When the doctor announced that the operation was inevitable, Don Beebe was surprised. His eyes widened. Then he furrowed his brows in a sign of confusion. "What do you mean I have to have surgery, doctor?" "Just that. You have an obstructed aorta, and it must be replaced with a pig valve." "A pig valve?" "Yes. Does that surprise you? Surely you know someone who has had open-heart surgery." Yeah, I know several. It's like a plague. Now everyone has open-heart surgery. Before it wasn't always that way." "Not everyone," Dr. Arbiza corrected. "And before, people just died from a heart attack. That's what we are going to avoid with timely intervention. This will improve your quality of life. You think you are healthy, but it won't take much more blockage to keep you from exercising. We must operate." "So," Don Beebe struggled to make sense of his diagnosis, "does this explain why I feel so tired all the time, even when I'm not sick?" "Without a doubt. You have a history of regular exercise and healthy lifestyle. There's no reason you should be tired from walking along the Rambla." The doctor's tone was resolute. Don Beebe promised to think about it, saying he needed to discuss it with his wife, Carmencita, and their 3 children. He knew the risks were low, because almost nobody died of heart surgery anymore. Yet he hesitated. There was still that 5% mortality rate. Somebody had to be in that 5%. Moreover, the very idea of cracking his chest open to get down to his heart, as if it were part of an Aztec ritual, terrified him. Unanimously, the family was in favor of the operation. In the end, the patient ran out of excuses, although he delayed the date of surgery as long as he could. One cold morning, a few months after their first meeting, Don Beebe felt ill and was taken to the emergency room at British Hospital. It was determined he had pre-infarction angina, a small heart attack preceding a more serious one. Dr. Arbiza attended him until he recovered, and the facts proved the young cardiologist correct in his diagnosis. By this time, the name of Santiago Arbiza had been noticed throughout the hospital and beyond, including to colleagues and new cardiac patients. Carmencita, the wife of Don Beebe, had repeatedly invited Santiago to tea in their posh Carrasco home to meet their daughter, who was only 2 courses short of certification as a pediatrician. But he kept using his work as an excuse, saying he had a full schedule, with no breaks. Carmencita mounted a campaign to convince her husband to move forward with the operation, including promises of a trip to Miami. "Have you been to Miami?" she asked the doctor during one appointment. She had taken to accompanying her husband in order to work together with the doctor to persuade Don Beebe of his need for surgery. "Yes, many times." "We have never been there," Carmencita complained. "The United States. Can you believe that? A career soldier like my husband, who always fought for democracy during the rioting. He never wanted to go to America. Says he doesn't know a word of English. But I think that's just an excuse." "He doesn't need to know English to visit the United States," Dr. Arbiza responded. "In fact, in Miami, more people speak Spanish than English anyway." "I knew it!" Carmencita exclaimed triumphantly. "Of course, that's where all the Castro exiles are. My husband would have so much to discuss with any of them. You see, Beebe, what the doctor said?" She turned to her husband as if he had not just been listening. "In Miami, nearly everyone speaks Spanish." Colonel Ruiz Diaz grimaced. Carmencita babbled on. "We have to visit Miami before we die. I went to Europe with you. Or we could go to New York instead. I don't really care. Why not? This is not open for discussion, as you always like to say. No more excuses about language. What do you say to that, old man?" "Enough." The colonel held up a hand to stop his animated wife. "I will have the operation, but I will not go to America. Just thinking of all the research it would take to get a visa feels like a punch in the balls. Those Yankees think they are the cream of the crop, but they are only traitors." The more he spoke, the more vehement his words became. "They will use you up and then throw you away like a dog. You never know what to expect from them, because some defend freedom while other communists hide behind the law and put fucking Rambo in jail, but forget about all those laws when Rambo is doing what he needs to do. No, no way. I prefer to enjoy my last days among my people, here in my own little country. I've got a great retirement here that is well deserved after a lifetime of serving the motherland." A silence fell over the room for a moment as he finished. "Well, hallelujah!" Carmencita beamed. "At least you're going to have the operation, old man. That's as much as I could expect from a stubborn curmudgeon like you." The surgery was scheduled for Thursday, April 15th, because Don Beebe would not hear of being opened up on Tuesday, the 13th. His wife agreed. That morning, the waiting room was filled with family and close military friends. As soon as the anesthesiologist had set up the drip, Dr. Arbiza requested the anesthesiologist and his assistant to leave him alone with the patient in order to confirm the patient's psychological state before the procedure. The assistants did not understand this departure from protocol, but they obeyed the order out of respect for this reputable young cardiologist. Don Beebe nodded to Santiago and asked if everything was okay. The doctor confirmed, "Yes, everything is fine. In a few hours you will be feeling much better." "I'm in your hands, doctor. I trust your science." "Okay, now tell me freely. How do you feel?" The doctor tried to calm his eagerness for what was about to happen. "Well, I feel pretty good. A little relaxed. Like I just had a little whiskey. Everything seems to be slowing down." "Yes, that is to be expected. You know, once upon a time, whiskey was the only drug we had to use for amputating legs." The doctor leaned in close. An intensity had come over him that Don Beebe wasn't sure he had seen in their earlier appointments. But Beebe wasn't sure of much at all. At the moment, he felt himself detaching from the body in the hospital bed. Santiago continued, "Anesthesia is not only relaxing, but also helps to unlock the oldest memories. Do you remember anything about your childhood?" Yes. Beebe's voice grew faint. "I remember a horse that was given to me for a birthday in Rivera. It was actually a pony, but to me it was huge. I even remember the smell of horse and honeysuckle." "And did you ever fall off your horse?" "I fell off and landed on my face in a honeysuckle thicket." "Is that where you get the scar in your trapezius muscle?" "My trapezius muscle?" Beebe's eyes flickered with the effort to understand. "Yes, you know, the Z-shaped scar," Santiago persisted. "Oh, yes." He reached up to touch it. "This one here, behind my neck." Beebe took a breath as he concentrated on his words. "No, that happened when I was climbing over barbed wire in training camp. Fucking rusty spike caught my skin and wouldn't let go, like a fishhook. God, that hurt. I pulled the wire out and it made a terrible gash in my skin. It got infected, too. Took forever to heal." He trailed off for a moment, then resumed. "I fainted from the pain of that. It was my first year in the military, and they shamed me for a year." His words came heavy, slow. "Had to wait for a whole new crop of recruits to come to show me some respect. That time took forever to pass. I felt like shit. But now..." The colonel's eyes sought Santiago from far away. "Now I remember that clearly, but I feel fantastic. Can you believe that?" "It's the anesthesia. It makes you feel good even when thinking of the worst memories." "Of course." "I remember that scar too, you know," Santiago stated, as if this were a perfectly ordinary fact. "There's another scar crossed over the top of it, like a perfect swastika tattoo." Despite his drugged condition, Beebe was startled and nodded agreement. "I never forgot that scar," continued Santiago. "My parents had a farm in Rivera. When 2 army jeeps arrived one night, my mother ran to the kitchen. I have fragmented images. Fractured. Kid stuff. Then I remember that the soldiers bound my father's arms and wound a thick rope around his chest. My mother tried to intervene, but one of them pulled her back into the house. I remember my father being dragged through a field behind a horse, as if he were a plow. For a long time I have thought about how my father must have worried about holding on to that rope while the stones and thorns tore up his body, because if he let go of the rope, he would die of suffocation. Somewhere in my memory I can still hear my mother's cries. I was in the barn, hiding in a high box where the hens would lay eggs. From one of the holes in the box I could see how they brought first my father and then my mother. They were thrown into a jeep, nearly naked." Santiago's voice was husky with raw emotion. He continued to describe the memory. "Finally, the other 2 soldiers searched the entire house and barn, until they discovered me in the hen box. I don't remember ever crying. I only remember that one soldier took me by the arm and led me to the other jeep. My fist grabbed tight to the hair on the back of his head, while I tried to break open the Z-shaped scar with the fingers on my other hand. And the scar would not open. My nails ripped on his sweaty skin. Don Beebe's wide eyes filled with terror. Santiago appraised him coldly. Now, Colonel, tell me where they are. I don't know what you mean. With all his might, the colonel tried to focus. Colonel, you have very little time. Santiago was blazing, intense with need. The anesthesia is working. I know you remember that time perfectly well. Now, you are the one who gave me to the Arbiza Mendez family. I need to know where my parents are buried. He rushed on. I want to know my name, my first name. Maybe my name was Carl. Or Camilo. Who was I before I was called Santiago Arbiza? I do not know what you mean, the colonel managed a weak tone of defiance. Look in my eyes, the doctor demanded fiercely. We are just minutes from the most important moment of your life. You will tell me. Are you threatening me? Beebe was horrified. Yes. All right. It doesn't change anything. I will tell you everything, he sighed. I gave you to the Arbiza family. I was just following orders. And were you just following orders when you squeezed my father's testicles and sent him to be dragged through the field before throwing him on the jeep like a dying animal? My father was tied, and you had 3 men guarding him. Is that the respect for human life you learned in the army? Santiago was in a full rage by now, venting decades of fury and loss to this old soldier. And were you also following orders when you grabbed my mother's ass and said, set aside a little for the colonel? But you were just a lieutenant then, and you helped yourself a little before leaving her for your superior, right? Because you had your own lecherous urges. I mean, pardon me if I am wrong. I was only 3 years old. But this one last single image I remember. The image of a woman being dragged into a jeep topless. And yet the law protects you all, because there is always a criminal discount for wholesalers like the military. And I am left with no choice to continue speculating on fragmented facts that I hold like shards of glass inside my chest. Tell me, Colonel, he seethed. What happened next? Was it not enough humiliation to torture them like that, so you also had to make them vanish without a trace? At this point, despite all his careful calculations, Santiago made the biggest mistake of his life. The colonel was indeed about to reveal where they had buried his parents, but he ran out of time. The anesthesia pulled him into a deep sleep. Maybe on that fateful night, the lieutenant, in his 30s and in peak physical condition, had forced himself on Maria Ocampo in the kitchen, promising mercy for her husband if she cooperated. But Beebe also knew that he had restrained from violating Maria, because he knew there was a son hidden somewhere in the house. The husband had broken sooner than they expected, not on the field but in the barracks. Lieutenant Ruiz Diaz had heard the obscenities of Colonel Maximo Galimberti as he shouted about how the soldiers had fucking learned nothing from these prisoners, how what the doctors gave them was useless in controlling how much a person would divulge before they broke and died. So both the woman and her husband died revealing nothing, not even false names invented to escape the horrible torture. The female was a complete waste, according to the colonel, with those blue eyes and that frantic screaming for her baby instead of calming down and cooperating. She ended up dying of cardiac arrest. At least that's the story the soldiers were told before being assigned to a smaller mission. Carmencita did not know any of it. Only 2 of his friends who kept silent as graves. At 5:45, Dr. Santiago Arbiza appeared in the waiting room and announced that the operation had been a success. The first hug came from Carmencita, then Beebe's 3 sons and his brothers in arms, the youngest still in uniform. Don Beebe had a normal recovery. However, he said his wife was no longer the same. He had lost his taste for life and almost never went out to walk the Rambla. Dr. Arbaza said some depression was normal for many patients who had undergone cardiac surgery and could be easily controlled with medication. Bibi's daughter, who had been finishing pediatrician school, passed her licensing exams. Most importantly, the doctor said, was that his life expectancy had now increased to at least 15 or 20 years. The moment Don Bibi opened his eyes, he looked at the doctor and asked why he was still alive. The doctor said simply that he was sure the colonel would never tell where the bones of his parents were, and that it would take a national referendum to compel him to confess. So until justice could be served, the best duty of the wartime criminals was to live long. Because, unlike Don Bibi and Carmencita, the doctor did not believe in hell or in justice from a higher power. So that was the worst thing that could happen to Colonel Ruiz Diaz, to live long, remembering whatever he had been going to confess, cursing the bastard doctor for every new day of life that God gave him.